مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أمريكا دولة شابة أكثر شبابا بكثير من معظم الدول الأوروبية، وطفل رضيع مقارنة بالدول الثلاث صاحبة الهدارة في الشرق الأوسط: مصر وإيران وتركيا. بالتاريخ لا يزيد عن 238 عاما يسهل تذكر التاريخ الهام، وهذا العام 2014 عام مليء بالتواريخ الهامة الواجب تذكرها. يمر هذا العام 60 عاما على صدور قرار المحكمة الدستورية العليا بعدم قانونية التمييز في المدارس العامة، وأمرها بجلوس الطلاب السود والبيض معا في الولايات كثيرة لأول مرة. ويمر هذا العام 50 عاما على نجاح الرئيس جونسون في تمرير قانون الحقوق المدنية وإعلانه الحرب على الفقر، وهما تغييران من أهم التغييرات التي شهدها المجتمع الأمريكي على مر تاريخ دولتنا. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنلقي نظرة فاحصة على هذه المناسبات الأربعة وما تعنيه بالنسبة للسياسة اليوم، مع اللجنة المكونة من الخبيرين السياسيين مورتن كندراكي ونورمان أورنستين. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. I'm here with our panel of political experts. Gentlemen, very happy to have you both with us again.
It'd be great to be here.
We're going to take a moment to look at some anniversaries that America is recognizing this year. This is a very special year of a number of historical moments that we're recalling. Let's start with the 100th anniversary of World War I. And there's so many aspects of this important moment in world history that are still with us today. But when I say World War I to you, and really to most Americans, what do you think most Americans think of?
Most Americans probably don't think of it at all. I mean, World War I, I mean, it was, as you say, a very long time ago. To those of us who, read history, the word that arises is catastrophe. I mean, it was a war that could have been avoided, that happened because of a series of entangling alliances between the various powers of Europe, who all agreed that if somebody went to war with somebody else, then you had to go to war too. And the result of it was a cataclysm involving every country in Europe. And it was an era when when weapons were becoming sophisticated, but tactics were not. So that men were thrown against machine guns, wave after wave after wave, on both sides, on both the Allied side and the German side, and whole halves of generations of Germans and Brits and French and Belgians and were annihilated in the war, and it created a reluctance to get involved in combat, which, because of the terms of the settlement, led to the rise of Hitler and the refusal of any countries to resist him until it was too late.
What do you think?
I would offer a couple of additional perspectives. One is, it started really with a mindless act and an accident. The assassination of an archduke by a deranged individual, or at least a renegade individual, which tells you something about how wars can come about often through little accidents of history that can cause the catastrophes that Mort talked about. The second part of it is that because it was so awful and catastrophic, and the outcome in the end was not a particularly good one. Of course, from the perspective of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, the president, had hoped that he could use this to build a new international community. The League of Nations, it went down in flames when the Treaty of Versailles was not approved by the Senate, but it also brought in a strong wave of isolationism in the United States. I have a friend who just died at 98 named Bob Stewart, who was an ambassador to Norway under Ronald Reagan, a strong Republican, friend of mine because he was also very much for campaign finance reform. But his obituary sort of surprised me because it said that he had been a leader with a number of other very prominent Americans in the America First movement between the two wars. And they gave up after Pearl Harbor, of course, and he enlisted and became a decorated soldier. But the attitude across a lot of prominent Americans was a catastrophe like this, we can't get involved again. And we see this repeated throughout history. You have a major war, a major catastrophe. You then have a struggle for a long time in the United States over how much do we stay involved. We can't afford another entanglement of this sort. In a different way, but in a very parallel way. We're going through some of that now.
I mean, World War I, Wilson says to fight for democracy, and in the end, America recedes from the world. Parallels to the last decade and where we are today?
Well, as Norm says, I mean, what happens is that the United States gets itself involved in an unpleasant circumstance. Vietnam was another example of a war we lost. And the country had turned against it. And for a decade, we underspent on the military. We gave the world the message that the United States is not strong. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and began, expanding in Africa, and Cuba was sending troops all over Central America and so on. And it was largely because it was a reaction against the Vietnam experience. Ronald Reagan came along and corrected the situation, and the Soviet Union fell. But then, George W. Bush got us involved in a war in Iraq, and everybody ended up hating it, and Afghanistan as well. And now we're in a period when we don't want to put troops on the ground anywhere. We don't want to assert ourselves anywhere. We want to lead from behind. And the tigers are prowling the world again. The Chinese are acting up, Putin's acting up, the terrorists are acting up, and then it's because there's no policeman in town.
Well, in a certain way, that leads me to the next anniversary to recall, which is the 70th anniversary of D-Day. Now, this was perhaps the last good war that America fought. Is that the way you think most Americans would consider World War II?
Oh, I think there's little doubt about that. I think there might be a mixed reaction on Korea, but basically there's no question that the last good war in the larger sense was the Second World War. Now, I give George Herbert Walker Bush some credit for what was, I think, a noble effort in the first Gulf War to deter aggression of Iraq against Kuwait. But that was small potatoes compared to the Second World War. If you go back and watch either the movie The Longest Day, which was a rather majestic movie from the 1960s on D-Day, or even more, Saving Private Ryan, the first 15 minutes is a graphic display of the lives lost, the bloodshed, the carnage that D-Day brought about. But it broke the back of the Nazis, and it ended that war effectively. And the heroism displayed by Americans, the fact that we consider them the greatest generation now, that every time we have one of these anniversaries and a president goes over, Ronald Reagan gave that stirring speech with an earlier anniversary, reminds America of the noble role that it's played. I remember going to Normandy a few years ago, standing on the beach or on the rocks above the beach and having French people who lived there come over to me and thank me for what the United States had done. We don't get too many of those thank yous these days.
Now, World War II in many respects may have been the last time there was national cohesion and unity of effort here and abroad for an international undertaking.
Well, I would say, another good war was the Cold War. I mean, we really did have, Harry Truman looked at the world and saw the Soviet Union on the march. And there was a big debate about, there were people who wanted to go, George Patton, having won World War II, arrived in Berlin and he said, let's keep on going, all the way to Moscow. People wanted to use the nuclear weapon against China and Russia, get them out of the way. George Kennan, a great diplomat, said, no, the way to do this is contain them, resist them wherever they're trying to advance and so on. And we had, it wasn't easy. You had isolationists who had to be persuaded, but fundamentally from 1945 until the Soviet Union fell in 1991, you had a national consensus. It had its problems, but nonetheless, you had a basic national consensus that the Soviet Union was an enemy that had to be resisted, and we stuck it out and we won.
Okay, when we come back, I'm going to ask you, what might it take for there to ever be that sort of national consensus again, in just a moment. Again, my panel of political experts includes Mort Kondracki. Mort has been a journalist for more than 40 years. He's the senior editor of Roll Call, an insider newspaper covering Capitol Hill, and he has served as the Jack Kemp Fellow at the Library of Congress. In his career, Mort has been the senior editor of The New Republic, Washington bureau chief of Newsweek, a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and a regular panelist on major network news analysis shows. Sitting next to him is Norman Ornstein. Norm is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, an election analyst for BBC News, and a columnist for National Journal and The Atlantic magazines. His written work includes The Permanent Campaign and Its Future and The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and What Can Be Done About It. His newest book is It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. Well, let's turn from polarization on national security issues to important domestic issues, because this year is also a key anniversary of a number of major historic moments on the domestic front. 60 years since the Supreme Court made a dramatic decision, unanimously throwing out segregation, separation of black students and white students in public schools. And 50 years since the war on poverty and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, ensuring greater equality and the ability to vote for all Americans. So let's talk about these issues for a moment. Race relations in our country today, what the Brown versus Board of Education decision addressed. Did Brown succeed? Did the decision succeed in addressing the inequality in schools?
It helped, although it took a very long time, and it hasn't ended inequality in schools. One of the things that's important to realize in contrast with today, the Brown versus Board of Education decision actually was stretched out over 2 Supreme Court terms. The justices knew that to do something like that, which was shaking the fabric of the society, you didn't want to do it on a narrow decision, 5-4 with 9 justices. So they worked for 2 years to make it unanimous. Today, every decision involving race or voting or campaign finance is on a 5-4 basis with a great division. Just recently, we had a decision on affirmative action where the majority behind Chief Justice John Roberts took a position that the way to end discrimination on the basis of race is not to discriminate on the basis of race. And Sonia Sotomayor, a Latina justice, gave her dissent from the bench, did it orally, which is a rare thing. It indicates a real passion, and basically said to John Roberts and his 4 white male colleagues, you have no idea what it's like to be a minority and what you face in this country. And it's easy to say, just don't discriminate, but that's not the reality 60 years after Brown. So these divisions persist, but the fact is we have come an incredible distance in terms of racial relations and non-discrimination. 50 years ago, in most places, it was illegal for an African American to marry a white individual in many southern states. Now that's a commonplace. We have very different attitudes towards race generally. But then you get people popping up like Cliven Bundy, who became a hero on the right for resisting the government when they wanted to have him pay what he owed on grazing fees for his cattle. And he basically said the Negro was better off under slavery. I mean, you know, it's still there as a problem.
Affirmative action, has it reached its end of its life, and should it?
Frankly, I think it should. If the son of a black executive, CEO of a company, and you can be black and be there are a lot of companies in America that have black CEOs. His child wants to go to Harvard. Should he or she get a preference over the child of a plumber just because of the color of their skin? You know, I don't think so. I think you ought to base affirmative action on the basis of income, on the basis of overcoming hardship. You know, I don't think that people ought to simply get slots on the basis of the color of their skin. That is, you know, I think it is more compassionate, more equalizing in the society to do on the basis of income, on the basis of background, than it is on the basis of race.
I agree with that, but the problem we have now is that where universities, for example, or others have set admissions policy based on a whole range of characteristics, including income and overcoming obstacles, but with race as one of them, and in part to try and get a diversity within the population. The courts are starting to rule against that. And even things where you're using only income, but you're doing it by districts so that you know you're going to get a sufficient representation of minorities. This Supreme Court frowns on that. So we're moving in a direction that is starkly more discriminatory than what Mort is suggesting.
Well, let me ask you about that set of issues that you raised, which is inequality. As I said earlier, it's the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society undertaking. Did we win or did we lose the war on poverty?
Well, we certainly made advances. I mean, the kind of poverty that existed in 1964 was desperate poverty. I mean, third world style poverty, and it still exists in some places in the United States, but it's much reduced. The problem, I think, is that the Johnson, what developed out of Lyndon Johnson's program was that we gave people a lot of fish, and we didn't teach them how to fish for themselves, and so we still have too many people living in poverty, and it seems to me that the key to it has got to be to upward mobility, has got to be through education reform, to give people the kind of skills that it takes to compete in a global environment. Now, here you have right now, and you had an effort on the part of the governors of all the states to get together and raise the standards of education across the country. It was the governors. It was not the federal government. And you've now got
it's called the Common Core.
The Common Core. You now have an unholy alliance between the right and the right wing, including some pretty smart people on the right wing, and the teachers' unions who don't want competition of any kind, to kill the Common Core, which means that low standards, low performance will persist in the country until we solve the problem.
You know, there's a big debate going on about this now, which is a very good and healthy debate. There are a number of people, especially on the right, who say all those government programs didn't do anything. Look at the rate of poverty. The rate of poverty is still about 16%, but that's counting cash income. And the fact is, if you begin to count in the subsidies that are there with those government programs, most of them initiated by Lyndon Johnson 50 years ago in the Great Society, and food stamps and housing allowances, the earned income tax credit, the number of people who are in the kind of poverty that Mort is talking about has declined very significantly. We do have a debate now about what you can do to lift the remainder out of poverty. Part of it is if people are working, you have a social contract that they should be at least earning enough money so that they can afford a place to live, put food on the table and the like, and the minimum wage just doesn't do that. There are perverse incentives in some of these government subsidies that make it better for you not to work than to work. The extra dollar that you earn takes away enough of those subsidies that you actually don't get anything in addition. There are some conservatives who are now starting to tackle this problem. There is actually a common ground there. But in this polarized environment, it doesn't seem to be taking us anywhere that would have us take the next step that Johnson envisioned.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. It's hopefully these sorts of anniversaries will trigger more national conversations about all these important topics that we've been talking about today. Thank you. Look forward to having you back shortly. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول المناسبات التاريخية الهامة في بلدكم، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.